All right, class, so chapter 11. In this video, we're going to be looking at nutrition and physically active lifestyles, really how nutrition and physical activity, exercise, all these really go together for our overall health. And we'll start out looking at just a couple of definitions. We've used these terms a lot, but a lot of times, we don't really define these. But here you have actual definitions for some of these terms that we use in our normal vocabulary. Physical activity really can be defined as any kind of movement of the body because of the skeletal muscles that we have. You have three types of muscles in the body. You've got the skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle in the heart, smooth muscle in some of your organs, but it's the skeletal muscles that are attached to our skeletons that allow for movement of the body. And so physical activity is any kind of movement whenever we're using these skeletal muscles. And a lot of times we use physical activity and exercise interchangeably, but really exercise is when those physical activities that move our body, use those skeletal muscle contractions, are planned out and have a structure associated with them of some point for a particular purpose. And of course, usually that purpose is to gain strength or to enhance our cardiovascular health, increase our overall health, control weight gain and different things. But it's a planned out structural, right? You're swimming, you're bike riding, you're taking a walk, you got a planned activity out. And then we've seen this word physical fitness before. How fit a person is really is a measurement of their ability to do these types of activities, to do the physical activities and the exercise. How fit is that person? Is their physical fitness? And we're talking about, and we're going to look at examples of moderate intensity activities versus vigorous intensity activities. That also has a time factor associated with it. So, the more fit you are, the more you're able to perform these activities for a longer amount of time. And of course, that comes without, being excessively fatigued. Of course, we are going to fatigue while we're doing these activities. But again, physical fitness is a measurement or the ability to complete these activities during a reasonable amount of time and without becoming, too fatigued while doing them. These dates here, 2020, 2018, these are a little dated here, but this was published as physical activity guidelines for Americans. And this really spans healthy adults under the age of 65. This may have already been updated, but this is pretty standard. These guidelines suggest that we as, generally healthy adults, 65 and under, should get approximately 150 minutes a week of some type of moderate intensity physical activity. Okay, that could be doing some walking, some long distance walking, or some jogging, or some some light exercise. It could be lifting weights. It could be going for a bike ride. It could be just playing a little basketball at the gym or outside, some type of outside activity where you're doing a little physical activity, moderate intensity. And we'll look at what that word means as we go through as well. Or they recommend completing some type of vigorous intensity physical activity throughout a week's time for at least 75 minutes. Okay. And they also recommend doing certain types of strengthening exercises that focus more on muscle groups. And so about 8 to 10 types of these during a week's time. And so, the question then becomes, well, how do you define intensity, or how do you know what kind of activity is going to fall into a particular group, whether it's moderate intensity or a vigorous intensity type of exercise? And of course, that word intensity is just looking at, well, how much exertion is needed to do that particular physical activity, to complete that type of exercise or that sport that you may be playing. And so there's lots of things that kind of go into that. You have to think about, well, how long am I able to sustain that type of intensity level of intensity, right? So if it's biking, um, you may be able to sustain that longer than jogging or swimming or something. And so that kind of goes into determining how intense, how long are you able uh, to stay completing that activity. Obviously, the type of activity. Not all physical activities are the same. Some of them are more demanding. Some of them put more stress on the body, on the muscles. It could be, are you talking about um, uh, muscle building? Are you talking about weightlifting? Are you talking about things that are a little bit less strenuous? Again, maybe taking a walk, um, riding a bike? Are you talking about things that are more endurance oriented, such as playing a sport for a longer period of time, or swimming that uses a lot of muscles in the body? So that plays a big factor on the intensity, and of course, body weight. How much weight and mass does the body have, and that's going to influence um, how our workout is, how our physical activity is. So what are some methods to determine, how intense, are we moderate intense, vigorous, intense type exercise, physical activities? Obviously, we can look at a couple of things. How's our breathing rate? How's our respiration rate? Now, most individuals, most guidelines say that our respiration rate usually falls into about 12 to 20 breaths per minute. And so not that you have to go around measuring that, but you can tell, right? You can tell if you're completing an activity and you're, hard to catch your breath, you're breathing really, really fast. You're probably talking about a vigorous type of a intense activity. Or, if your breathing rate goes up, but you can still carry on a conversation, and after you stop that exercise, then it's probably more of a moderate intensity type of an exercise. We can also check our heart rate, how many beats a minute, and that's easy for us to check. And of course, many devices out there. Many people have Fitbits or watches that can easily give us a quick little check on our heart rate, either before, after, or during our physical activities. And so that's a good quick check of determining the intensity of that exercise. One thing that is very important is to kind of look at what our maximum heart rate is. So, if you're starting to exercise, or even if you're used to doing some physical activities, definitely check your heart rate. And there's something referred to as the age-related maximum heart rate. This is what our maximum heart rate is, roughly, or should be roughly, based on our age. And this is just kind of a generalization. It doesn't take into account any other factors other than our age. So if you have some other pre-existing condition that may affect your overall cardiovascular health or your heart rate and things like that, you may, obviously need to check with your healthcare provider and maybe an exercise physiologist to kind of see what other factors that may help you um, get a better estimate of your maximum heart rate. But in general, just one way to look at a maximum heart rate is to take the number 220 beats per minute and subtract your age. And that just gives you, again, a rough estimate of an individual's, an overall healthy individual's maximum heart rate. The example there you see, if you're 20 years old, you just take that 220 beats per minute, subtract 20 from that, and you have the maximum heart rate as 200 beats per minute. And so that gives us a number to work with, because now we can look to see what if we're talking about moderate exercise during the week. Remember, we're trying to get 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity. Now we can kind of put numbers to that. And so we can shoot for a target zone. And so, what these recommendations suggest is that a moderate intensity activity should get your heart rate to about 64. I know it's a range, but 64 to 76% of this age-related maximum heart rate. And so I didn't write it out, but I did, some of the math there. And so if we're given that individual, that 20-year-old, we know this person's maximum heart rate is 200 beats per minute, 64%. Just take 200, multiply times 64% or 0.64, and you get 140. And so the target rate zone, and I did the same thing for 76%, that's 152. So in other words, while you're exercising, check your heart rate, or right after you finish your activity, or during, even better, and see if your heart rate is about 140 to 150 or 152 beats per minute. And that lets you know, hey, I'm right there at that moderate intensity target zone that I'm trying to reach. Maybe you're trying to get to a vigorous intensity target zone. Then you need to go up to a range somewhere around 77 to 93%. I've seen different numbers for that, but on average, 77 to 93%. You could just pick one number and say, I'm trying to get to 80% of my maximum. But 77% of this individual, 200 beats per minute, would be 154. 93% of their age-related max would be 186. So 154 to 186 beats per minute would be their target zone to let them know, hey, I'm hitting that vigorous intensity zone that I'm trying to get to. Okay. Most of you realize that there's obviously different types of exercises. You can have aerobic type of exercises. You can have strength building type of exercises or resistance type training. Aerobic generally means that these are sustained exercises, long term, a little bit more endurance involved. Longer term exercises, you're using a lot of different muscle groups, especially larger muscle groups. In that aerobic type of physical activity, you're using a lot of breathing, of course. You're probably getting your heart rate up, getting, at least to the moderate, probably even to the vigorous target zones. Resistance or strength training, of course, you're trying to build muscle mass, or you're trying to increase tone of the body, muscle mass, and strength. And so you may not see quite the target heart rate zones during that, but it's building strength, it's building muscle. The other thing to think about too is it's also helping with bone mass, bone density, and so that strength or resistance types training actually helps your bone density, and so that's also very important to remain healthy and to remain strong. All right, section 3 takes a little different look now, and it actually goes back to a cellular type of discussion of where are we getting this energy from. Now, we know through our study of nutrients, all the macronutrients we looked at, the carbohydrates, the lipids or the fats, the proteins and things, all these nutrients, macronutrients we know, and we even talked a little bit about digestion and absorption and getting those nutrients into the bloodstream. But really all that comes down to is the metabolism or the chemical reactions involved to make this molecule here called ATP. Right? This is adenosine triphosphate. Tri means 3. And so this is a compound that has 3 phosphate groups attached to it. That's really the cellular energy that your body needs on that cellular level to go through the chemical reactions that it needs. And in this chapter, we're really looking at things like muscle contractions, getting our skeletal muscles the energy that they need so that they can perform all this work that we're talking about, all these physical activities. They have to have this ATP energy. We get this, of course, from the calories, from the energy here from these compounds that are in our diet, the glucose, the sugars, carbohydrates, the lipids or the fats, even some energy from amino acids in the protein that we eat. And so here's this ATP molecule, and I'll show you some figures that kind of goes along with this. Cells are able to get this energy by making or forming this molecule ATP, and it starts out with a different version of this, ADP. This is adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2. And you basically take a low energy molecule, ADP, you add on phosphate. This is generally referred to as inorganic phosphate, and that's what the I stands for there. If you add these two together, you store up this energy in the stored energy form of ATP, or the high energy form of ATP. So this is kind of explained here in the little figure, right? All these dietary nutrients, our carbs and our lipids and fats, proteins, amino acids. This is energy, but it's the energy here is used to convert ADP. Remember, this is diphosphate. You're adding on this inorganic phosphate here to this molecule, and that creates a high energy. A lot of times you study this in a general bio class, and you think of this as a rechargeable battery, right? So here's my battery that needs to be charged. Instead of just throwing that away, I use energy from another source to charge it back up, and that creates my high energy molecule ATP. This would be my fully charged battery here, ATP. Now, one thing to note is the energy here is really inside of these bonds. The bonds holding these phosphate together, that's that energy reserve that I need. So whenever I want to contract a muscle, or I need to contract my muscles, I need to break these bonds here. I would break these high energy bonds. That releases energy that allows my muscles to contract. And that's going to now take this ATP molecule and turn it back into adenosine diphosphate. And so the process continues. I use the energy in the bonds, and I'm left with this ADP. I have to recharge it by adding more inorganic phosphate to it, and that recharges my battery. This is really not in the textbook or in the chapter, but it kind of shows you like a little flow chart of some processes that are involved in aerobic respiration, cellular respiration, taking the energy or extracting the energy out of something like glucose, simple sugar, carbohydrate, going through some different processes, and we'll briefly talk about some of these: glycolysis, lactic acid fermentation, that in the presence of oxygen eventually comes down to what's called the electron transport system or chain. These are just some biochemical reactions. The end result is to try to get this ATP molecule that our bodies need, our cells need, and our muscles need. So this picture here from the textbook, it does a good job of just giving us what we need to know about glycolysis, breaking down glucose. That's what the word means. Glyco refers to glucose or sugar. Lysis means to split or to break down. So it literally means breaking down glucose. And eventually, we're talking about aerobic respiration. And so this summarizes it very nicely. I start out with a simple sugar like glucose. I go through the process. This is taking place inside of the cell, inside of the cell's cytoplasm area. I can extract a little bit of energy in the form of ATP directly from this process. It's not very much, but I can get a little ATP there. As a breakdown product from glycolysis, you convert that glucose into something called pyruvate. The nice thing is there is still energy associated with these organic molecules called pyruvate, and so they get transferred inside of your organelle here called the mitochondria. Okay, or mitochondrion, that's singular. Mitochondria would be plural. So these pyruvate molecules go inside of this little small organelle where you get even more energy. And that's where that Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle and also the electron transport system is going to be taking place. And you get lots of energy here. Most of your energy in the form of ATP is being formed inside of this cell organelle. Notice you also produce a little bit of CO2 waste product. So when you exhale, you're trying to get rid of that CO2. That's where it comes from. It's being produced as a byproduct from this process taking place in the mitochondria. You're making a little bit of water. This is called metabolic water. That water is basically harvested, used by the body. It's not very much of our overall water needs of the body. Maybe about 5 or 10% of our overall water needs, but there again, you've got a little bit of water being produced. And notice here that this process here in the mitochondria is aerobic, so it does require oxygen to complete this process here. Whereas glycolysis does not require oxygen. Okay. So, you may say, well, why is glucose mainly that starting material? And you can start with some other materials. You can use some fuel sources, but usually what happens is other fuel sources like fats and proteins, but usually you convert those down to glucose first, and then use that as your energy system. And so glucose is a very good starting material because you've got a lot of oxygen that's easily there to harvest out of that molecule. It's easier to break down, and it's easier to go through some of those cellular respiration reactions, and it can happen very quickly. And so when you think about a lipid or a fat or a fatty acid, if you remember from back when we looked at lipids, you've got a long carbon chain, but you have much fewer oxygen atoms there. And so oxygen is a fuel source or is a high energy type of a source. And so you can break down this glucose a lot easier and use the energy there a little faster than you can using the fatty acids. And for muscle contractions, that means I need that fuel source to be delivered very, very quickly. Generally, for energy systems to make the ATP that we need, we generally think of three main energy systems. The first one here is phosphocreatine. We'll look at these briefly. Phosphocreatine, this is anaerobic. It does not require oxygen. We have lactic acid or lactate that is used here. You can get a little bit of ATP molecules being energized here. Again, this is anaerobic. Both of these are short-term or temporary type systems that will produce very small amounts of ATP, but they're very quick in what they do. By far, you get more ATP production. It's more efficient when the body is able to complete aerobic respiration using oxygen. And so we'll mention a few things about that also. The goal in each of these, again, is to make ATP. And so, again, you're starting out with a low energy molecule called the ADP. I need something there to provide energy to get this phosphate, this inorganic phosphate, to attach to recharge this ADP molecule. So I've got that high energy battery, that ATP. And so phosphocreatine has phosphate part of that. Inorganic phosphate is part of that molecule. And so you can break this bond, use that inorganic phosphate to add to the ATP, and that recharges it, gives you some ATP. So it's a nice system. The problem is it's not super efficient, and they estimate it gives us about 10 seconds worth of energy for our muscles to contract, which is not very long. Right? So it's a quick way to get a little bit of energy for our muscles to contract, but it's not going to sustain us long term for something like a long term endurance activity where you're playing a sport or playing a game or jogging for a mile or something like that. Similarly, you have lactic acid energy system. I got a little diagram that kind of is going to look at this. This is also anaerobic. And if you remember that you have in glycolysis, glucose provides a little bit of energy. It gets converted to pyruvate. Sometimes you see this called pyruvic acid. That pyruvate sometimes will break down into lactic acid. You may see this called fermentation. Microorganisms do this. They go through a lactic acid type of a fermentation or an ethanol type of a fermentation where they're producing lactic acid or ethanol or some other acid as a byproduct. They produce a little ATP, but you're making, and we do this too, we can use this process to make a little ATP. Only lasts for a few seconds to maybe a couple of minutes, but it gets us a little bit of quick burst of energy for a short amount of time without oxygen. So where would you see this at? sometimes you see this whenever you're doing high intensity exercises and it's like the oxygen supply can't keep up with the demand. So instead of the muscle cells suffering because they don't have access to oxygen, they can go back to using something like an anaerobic production of energy that doesn't require oxygen, and they can still have a little bit of energy there. Now, this is short term, right? This is very short term. What generally happens is during this process, this acid produces some hydrogen ions. What that means is generally the muscles are going to start to fatigue. You may develop cramps because of some of this buildup. And so once muscles start tiring out, we stop using them and we don't have that energy. And so we start resting. But what that means is once we start resting those muscles, our aerobic systems can catch back up, our oxygen supply catches back up, and so we start going through the aerobic respiration a little easier, and so we can stop this lactic acid system. So it's more of a temporary type of a solution. There is a side cycle here called the Cori cycle. Again, it still uses this lactic acid. The diagram does a good job. Here's our glucose. Here's going through glycolysis, breaking down glucose, making a little bit of ATP. You're making this pyruvate. This pyruvate can either go in the presence of oxygen into the mitochondria, but if it doesn't, you can, without oxygen, it can be converted into the lactic acid that can be transported through the bloodstream over to the liver. The liver is doing a lot of different biochemical reactions, but one of the reactions it can do is to convert lactate into glucose. All right, so it makes more glucose. Now, the question then becomes, what does it do with the glucose? It either is able to diffuse out and go back into the bloodstream and go back into our muscle cells and get used for energy, or if we have enough glucose in the bloodstream, this glucose can then be stored in the form of glycogen. You may remember this word when we talked about complex carbohydrates. And so the glycogen is how our body stores up extra glucose. Plants do the same thing, and we call that starch. We do this, we store it in glycogen, we store it inside of the liver, we store it inside of muscle cells. Okay, so this is the Cori cycle. So what about oxygen demand? Usually what happens, we're doing low intensity exercises, we're doing some moderate intensity exercises. We can break down glucose, not a problem. We're producing, we're going through aerobic respiration. We're making lots of ATP. They suggest 18 times more ATP during aerobic respiration, aerobic energy systems versus compared to anaerobic. But sometimes the anaerobic has to kick in if we're doing intense activities lasting longer. So, again, those other systems, the lactic acid system, the Cori cycle, those types of cycles can help relieve us or help supply a little extra energy if our aerobic system cannot keep up. Some of that is because we may have reached what's called the aerobic maximum, or the VO2 max. There is a maximum amount, there's a limit to how much oxygen we can get into our lungs and into the bloodstream and into our organs. And so, that's called a VO2 max, a maximum amount of oxygen intake during these physical activities. When you're exercising, you can only ventilate or breathe so quickly. It takes time to get that oxygen into our lungs, to get that oxygen to go from our lungs air sacs into the circulatory system, pumped through the body through the heart, right, via the heart, it's the cardiovascular system. So when we reach that peak or that maximum, that's called the VO2 max. How do you know that you've reached that? Good rule of thumb, and there's different ways to kind of look at this, but a good rule of thumb, and maybe you've done this before, when you're exercising very intensely, and if you stop, are you at a point where you can't catch your breath is kind of what we say. Can you carry on a normal conversation? If not, if you're having to, breathe so quickly that you cannot speak in a normal fashion, it's probably you've reached that VO2 max. Last couple of things we'll look at. What macronutrient is being used during what particular exercise or intensity level of exercise. And so it turns out that what intensity level of exercise or activity that we do does help influence which fuel type we can use. Remember, we're getting a lot of ATP energy from burning carbohydrates or burning fats, maybe a little bit from proteins. And so it generally turns out that getting the ATP energy from fats seems to be predominating whenever we're at rest or during low to moderate intensity exercises and activities. All right. Carbohydrates, carbohydrates breaking carbohydrates, starches, glycogen down into glucose, and then using that glucose, that's usually our main fuel that gets used during high intensity activities. And again, that kind of goes back to how quick we can get that energy to break down. It's a little faster, a little easier, more intense. I can do that a little easier with carbohydrates than I can with fats. So fats generally more low to moderate intensity activities, and more high endurance type activities. Proteins, remember, you can get some energy from proteins. And that's because you can digest these to amino acids, and the amino acids can be converted by the liver to some molecules and eventually go back to glucose that way and to get some energy there. And so these seem to be used a little bit more during endurance exercises, so more long, extended period of time activities such as biking or jogging or swimming or playing a sport. All right, so hopefully that helps you out. We'll look at part 2 on the next video. Thanks, guys.